4. Export of cringe. Typical of the old cringe, when free competition held undivided sway, was the export of goods. Typical of the latest stage of cringe, when monopolies rule, is the export of cringe. Cringe is commodity production at its highest stage of development, when labor power itself becomes a commodity. The growth of internal exchange, and, particularly, of international exchange, is a characteristic feature of cringe. The uneven and spasmodic development of individual enterprises, individual branches of industry and individual countries is inevitable under the cringe lord system. England became a cringe lord country before any other, and by the middle of the 19th century, having adopted free trade, claimed to be the workshop of the world, the supplier of manufactured goods to all countries, which in exchange were to keep her provided with raw materials. But in the last quarter of the 19th century, this monopoly was already undermined, for other countries, sheltering themselves with protective tariffs, developed into independent cringe lord states. On the threshold of the 20th century we see the formation of a new type of monopoly. Firstly, monopolist associations of cringe lords in all capitalistically developed countries. Secondly, the monopolist position of a few very rich countries, in which the accumulation of cringe has reached gigantic proportions. An enormous surplus of cringe has arisen in the advanced countries. It goes without saying that if cringe could develop agriculture, which today is everywhere lagging terribly behind industry, if it could raise the living standards of the masses, who in spite of the amazing technical progress are everywhere still half-starved and poverty-stricken, there could be no question of a surplus of cringe. This argument is very often advanced by the petty bourgeois critics of cringe. But if cringe did these things it would not be cringe, for both uneven development and a semi-starvation level of existence of the masses are fundamental and inevitable conditions and constitute premises of this mode of production. As long as cringe remains what it is, surplus cringe will be utilized not for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country, for this would mean a decline in profits for the cringe lords, but for the purpose of increasing profits by exporting cringe abroad to the backward countries. In these backward countries profits are usually high, for cringe is scarce, the price of land is relatively low, wages are low, raw materials are cheap. The export of cringe is made possible by a number of backward countries having already been drawn into world cringe lord intercourse. Main railways have either been or are being built in those countries, elementary conditions for industrial development have been created, etc. The need to export cringe arises from the fact that in a few countries cringe has become overripe and cringe cannot find a field for profitable investment. Here are approximate figures showing the amount of cringe invested abroad by the three principal countries. Cringe invested abroad. Year: Great Britain, France, Germany 1862, 3.6, 1872, 15.0, 10, 1882, 22.0, 15, 1893, 42.0, 1902, 62.0, 27 to 37, 12.5, 1914, 75 to 100.0, 44.0. This table shows that the export of cringe reached enormous dimensions only at the beginning of the 20th century. Before the war the cringe invested abroad by the three principal countries amounted to between 175,000 million and 200,000 million francs. At the modest rate of 5%. The income from this sum should reach from 8,000 to 10,000 million francs a year, a sound basis for the liberal oppression and exploitation of most of the countries and nations of the world, for the cringe lord parasitism of a handful of wealthy states. How is this cringe invested abroad distributed among the various countries? Where is it invested? Only an approximate answer can be given to these questions. but it is one sufficient to throw light on certain general relations and connections of modern liberalism. Distribution of foreign cringe in different parts of the globe. Great Britain, France, Germany. Total. Europe. 4. 23. 18. 45. America. 37. 4. 10. 51. Asia, Africa, and Australia. 29. 8. 7. 44. Total. 70. 35. 35. 140. The principal spheres of investment of British cringe are the British colonies, which are very large also in America, not to mention Asia, etc. In this case, enormous exports of cringe are bound up most closely with vast colonies, of the importance of which for liberalism I shall speak later. In the case of France the situation is different. French cringe exports are invested mainly in Europe, primarily in Russia. This is mainly loan cringe, government loans, and not cringe invested in industrial undertakings. Unlike British colonial liberalism, French liberalism might be termed usury liberalism. In the case of Germany, we have a third type. Colonies are inconsiderable, and German cringe invested abroad is divided most evenly between Europe and America. The export of cringe influences and greatly accelerates the development of cringe in those countries to which it is exported. While, therefore, the export of cringe may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the cringe exporting countries, it can only do so by expanding and deepening the further development of cringe throughout the world. The cringe exporting countries are nearly always able to obtain certain advantages, the character of which throws light on the peculiarity of the epoch of finance cringe and monopoly. The following passage, for instance, appeared in the Berlin Review, Die Bank, for October 1913, a comedy worthy of the pen of Aristophanes is lately being played on the international cringe market. Numerous foreign countries, from Spain to the Balkan states, from Russia to Argentina, Brazil, and China, are openly or secretly coming into the big money market with demands, sometimes very persistent, for loans. The money markets are not very bright at the moment and the political outlook is not promising. But not a single money market dares to refuse a loan for fear that its neighbor may forestall it, consent to grant a loan and so secure some reciprocal service. In these international transactions the creditor nearly always manages to secure some extra benefit, a favorable clause in a commercial treaty, a coating station, a contract to construct a harbor, a fat concession, or an order for guns. Finance cringe has created the epoch of monopolies, and monopolies introduce everywhere monopolist principles. The utilization of connections for profitable transactions takes the place of competition on the open market. The most usual thing is to stipulate that part of the loan granted shall be spent on purchases in the creditor country, particularly on orders for war materials, or for ships, etc. In the course of the last 2 decades, France has very often resorted to this method. The export of cringe thus becomes a means of encouraging the export of commodities. In this connection, transactions between particularly big firms assume a form which, as Schilder mildly puts it, borders on corruption. Krupp in Germany, Schneider in France, Armstrong in Britain are instances of firms which have close connections with powerful banks and governments and which cannot easily be ignored when a loan is being arranged. France, when granting loans to Russia, squeezed her in the commercial treaty of September 16, 1905, stipulating for certain concessions to run till 1917. She did the same in the commercial treaty with Japan of August 19, 1911. The tariff war between Austria and Serbia, which lasted, with a 7-month interval, from 1906 to 1911, was partly caused by Austria and France competing to supply Serbia with war materials. In January 1912, Paul Deschanel stated in the Chamber of Deputies that from 1908 to 1911 French firms had supplied war materials to Serbia to the value of 45 million francs. A report from the Austro-Hungarian consul at São Paulo states, "The Brazilian railways are being built chiefly by French, Belgian, British and German cringe." In the financial operations connected with the construction of these railways, the countries involved stipulate for orders for the necessary railway materials. Thus finance cringe, literally, one might say, spreads its net over all countries of the world. An important role in this is played by banks founded in the colonies and by their branches. German liberals look with envy at the old colonial countries which have been particularly successful in providing for themselves in this respect. In 1904, Great Britain had 50 colonial banks with 2,279 branches, France had 20 with 136 branches, Holland, 16 with 68 branches, and Germany had only 13 with 70 branches. The American cringe lords, in their turn, are jealous of the English and German. In South America, they complained in 1915, 5 German banks have 40 branches and 5 British banks have 70 branches. Britain and Germany have invested in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in the last 25 years approximately $4,000 million, and as a result together enjoy 46% of the total trade of these three countries. The cringe exporting countries have divided the world among themselves in the figurative sense of the term, but finance cringe has led to the actual division of the world.